Well, good afternoon and welcome, everyone. It's so great to be back with all of you. I'm very heartened that a number of you figured out how to transition to this new platform. So apologies for all of the emails and confusion that you might have had as we figured out some of the technical difficulties, but we are really excited to be back together in this session of Four Rabbis and with our very special guest, Rabbi Ze'ev Smason. So thank you so much for being with us. I feel like we're like The View, like we've got, we're like the hosts of like So to say just a quick word, for those of you who might be new to this program, this has been a program that's been bringing together rabbis in the St. Louis area community to talk about issues that are impacting us, issues that are impacting the world, to really just talk openly and honestly and with friendship and just a desire to learn about these topics and really grappling. We often don't come to any kind of conclusions at the end of it, but I think the journey is really the goal here. So tonight, I'm saying this afternoon, I'm a little bit jet lagged. I just got back from Israel just less than a week ago. So forgive me if my timing's off, but that's appropriate because we're going to be talking about the new Israeli government. But before we do that, and before I do a little bit of framing, we do want to dedicate this session today to one of our longtime listeners. And Daniel, I'm just going to pass it to you to maybe just say a couple of sentences.
Yeah, so Bob Sparks, of a blessed memory, was a real lover of this program and of so much learning that happened, Jewish learning here that happened in St. Louis. He was a dedicated member of Sheremeth and B'nai El before that, and Jim led a really meaningful and touching funeral for him yesterday. But I've known Bob basically all of my life. His son Aaron and I have been dearest of friends since middle school. Where we discovered we're actually cousins through his dad by telling the same story about a crazy relative. And so just wanted to take this moment in a really deeply traditionally Jewish way to dedicate our learning that we're going to be doing today in Bob Sparks, his memory.
Thanks, Daniel. Jim, I don't know if you wanted to add anything about him.
Just to echo everything Daniel said, he was a lover of learning and a true mensch, and he is and will be missed. And I think it's a beautiful way for us to honor him and his memory, to dedicate our learning and our openness to growing intellectually in Bob's memory. So we pray that his memory is and will continue to be a blessing.
Amen. Thank you.
I had a chance to look at the obituary, and I saw that he affectionately referred to himself as Mr. Zelda Sparks. And I think many of us know Zelda, and I think that that's something that adds both a smile on our faces as well as an expression of humility on Bob's part as well that can help us remember him as we engage in our conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you for adding that. I will miss seeing his name popping up in the chat because he often had comments as we went along, and which I'll say also to invite all of you. So we're going to be doing this as a conversation among the four of us. We know that there are more of you out there. Some of you are here on the Zoom. Some of you are on Facebook and YouTube. For those of you who are here in the Zoom, you can feel free to put questions in the Q&A. You might be able to put things into the chat, and we notice it. We'll pay attention. We'll incorporate when we can.
And if you're watching on Facebook or YouTube, I have a little chat thing on the side, and we'll try to bring in those comments as well. Just drop your comments on whatever thread you're watching on.
Excellent. Okay, so Dana will be on that. So, let me just dive in on this because it feels like this is probably one of the biggest topics that I know I've been hearing about lately. But before I jump into talking about the Israeli government, I want to say that I'm really starting from a premise and a platform that to be Jewish in America is to have a relationship with Israel. I think definitely to be involved in the Jewish community in America, we can talk about what that relationship is. For some of us, it might be, people might be unsure how they want to define that relationship, but even defining that relationship in the negative is inherently a relationship, right? And grappling with a relationship is a relationship. So I'm starting from the very premise that American Jews have a relationship with Israel, even as there might be a diverse range of what that relationship is. And so there's been a lot of discussion, and I'm speaking here now from the perspective of American Jews, although people can bring in whatever perspectives they want. But there's been a lot of discussion about this new government in Israel, and particularly ways in which this new government has been unprecedented. I feel like that's the word I'm probably hearing more than anything else. And so I want to start off like just with this foundational question to say, does this feel different to you? And if it does, or if it doesn't, why or why not, right? To get into a little bit more. So Ze'ev, maybe as the guest, if I can open up with you and ask you to, like, does this feel different for you right now?
Okay, well, you'll probably, by first, I want to begin by saying thank you very much for accommodating this particular slot in the month, because I know it's not the normal time that you normally have these discussions. So I'd like to thank you, Daniel and Jim and Rory, for accommodating me. And if my screen goes dark back and forth, that's because I'm having a little bit of a camera issue. So it's not that I'm trying to hide, but it's just I'm trying to avoid being the green flash as we engage through the course of the discussions. Rory, to begin by answering your question, maybe I'll share two thoughts. One to begin with, perhaps a personal thought. My family and I enjoyed a wonderful simcha, a wonderful joyous occasion with the marriage of our daughter this past December, and I had the unique occasion to be able to officiate at my daughter's wedding. Among the many special opportunities of being able to officiate at my daughter's wedding, I saved a little bit of money on the clergy fees, but seriously, there's nothing quite like standing under the chuppah officiating at your daughter's wedding. And present was one of our two sons who lives in Israel, who serves in Miluim. He lives. Miluim is I think many of you know, the Israeli reserve service. So on his way back to Israel, my son Chia shared with me the following thought, and asked for a little bit of personal help, and I think that this will give both you and the listeners a little bit of a flavor of what it is that's going on in Israel. We have a different perspective as Americans, and I certainly do as well. So here's what it is that my son Chia wrote to me. He said, "Dad, for 3.5 weeks in January and February, I and my unit will be stationed," and I'm not going to mention the area in which we'll be stationed. We'll be stationed in the area performing an infantry assignment. Our mission will be to guard the roads and passengers from rocks, snipers, firebombs, and IED attacks, as well as protect the general population in the adjacent Israeli cities. In addition, we'll be responsible for maintaining the integrity of the borderline to ensure no unlicensed person cross into Israel. So I think that a lot of the discussion about the new government from an American perspective doesn't take into account the Israeli perspective of the not only the very real, but the palpable security concerns that exist that led to the election of the new government. So I'll terminate my brief remarks at that point and use that by way of introduction.
Great, thank you. Jim, can I toss it to you?
Sure, and thank you for sharing that, Rabbi Smason. We share something of which I wasn't aware until just a moment ago. I also 2.5 months ago had the great privilege of standing under the chuppah with my own son and his now wife. So I can echo that profound joy and blessing and privilege that you described, and it is and was a beautiful moment for me, one that was a source of great anxiety for me, as I'm sure for you, to have that responsibility. But and there's another similarity, which is ironic, that I wanted to just share as sort of bookends to your comment, which I think is extremely valid and important, that those who are on the front lines in the conflict, and whose lives are touched every day by the dangers of war and living in a dangerous situation, really experience it in a unique way. The second similarity to standing with my child under the chuppah, officiating at a wedding, was that in attendance at that wedding were also quite a number of friends of my son and his wife who came from Israel to be with us in the United States for their wedding. And during the course of the weekend together, we spent a lot of time talking with them about how they felt about the new government. And I think it's important just to acknowledge that there is a variety, a spectrum of points of view. While everyone, I think, shares a concern for their personal security, many of the people in attendance at the wedding of my son and his wife from Israel expressed grave concern and anxiety and sadness at the change of direction of the newly elected government, government at that time that hadn't even been formally installed in power. And so I think that we need to recognize that there are amongst our people a variety of very legitimate and important and equally valid perspectives that come from the context of personal security, which is absolutely a legitimate concern of the Jewish people, of the Jewish state, of its citizens, but also a deeply troubled concern for the human rights of all people, including the Palestinians who live in Israel, as well as those who live in the occupied territories, a concern for people of different genders, of different sexual orientations, of different economic levels. And all of these are being threatened in one way or another, I think, by this new government. And I think it's important to acknowledge that if we oversimplify and simply make this about security and self-defense, we miss one of the core values of Judaism, which is that we don't only concern ourselves with ourselves, but we also must find ways to care for every human being. So it's just interesting that we have such, a variety of ways of looking at the situation. That's my first thoughts.
Thanks, Jim. We'll have more time to unpack all of it. Daniel, let me throw it to you.
Yeah, really appreciate both of your reflections. I think I've been struck personally by how this new government has not really changed how I'm feeling or thinking about Israel or my relationship with Israel. I think it won't come as a surprise to longtime participants in this Four Rabbis session, but I have been for a while something of a pessimist when it comes to the future of Israel's democracy, as well as a pessimist when it comes to the possibility of a two-state solution anymore. And, the irony of that all in a personal sense is that it's actually in many ways freed me in my relationship to Israel. I feel like I'm not holding on to these golden calves that are sitting there and have let them go. And so I have a different relationship and have had a different relationship for a while. Now, I will say, for a long time in at least the conservative and reform movements in the United States, in many spaces, it has been considered, not permissible to criticize Israel for its treatment of Palestinians, but has been fair game to criticize Israel for its treatment of progressive denominations in Israel. And I'm rather struck by how overt this new government is talking about discriminating against Jewish religious movements that are not Orthodoxy in Israel, from calls to change the law of return, the right of return, to the Kotel agreements, to sort of all of the places that we see progressive Judaism having taken root and in many places starting to flourish in Israel. I'm really struck by how overt this new government is in opposition to that. certainly on a personal level, I'm much more concerned about the attempts to just entirely decimate the judiciary and any checks and balances on the power of the executive and legislative, which is, in many ways one branch in Israel because it's a parliamentary system. And, if anything, I think this new government has illustrated the reality that I have believed for a long time, which is that a two-state solution is not only no longer possible, but isn't even a part of the political discourse or reality of anyone. Right? The opposition to this new government isn't an opposition that's in favor of a two-state solution and is pushing for that. It's an opposition that also agrees on the broad premise of the status quo with the Palestinians in many ways, right? And so the only place that we really see the rights of Palestinians who have been in militarily occupied people for generations now is around the question of whether or not Israel will formally annex the West Bank or not. But again, in a personal level, I'm struck by how this new government, even with the hard right Ben Gvir and my doppelganger Smotrich, who really it's creepy how much he looks like me. I'm struck by how much I am not finding myself emotionally reactive to it.
I appreciate all of you sharing. I don't know. I'm trying to sort out all of my thoughts and feelings about everything. It was interesting. So I just mentioned I was in Israel. I just came back on Wednesday, and I had been there for close to about 10 days, mostly in Jerusalem. And it was interesting, like talking to a wide variety of people, some of whom were really eager to talk about this new government, some of whom were not interested in talking about the new government. Many of you know, this program started because all of Daniel and Jim and our involvement with Hartman, and then when Carney had been here as well. And so I was there for one of my winter sessions with Hartman, which was also interesting, like just broadly conceptualizing it, because I have now had a longer session than any of you have had. We extended, we've had less time, but because of COVID, we've extended. So we started in 2019. And it was interesting, like seeing the group really gel together. And this time, we've been through multiple Israeli elections, multiple American elections. The world has just, changed so drastically. And we were talking a lot about the ways in which the world keeps changing, and it feels faster and faster and faster. I do think there's a lot of ways in which this government is unprecedented. And it feels like everything right now is unprecedented, right? Like that's maybe the nature of the world, is to keep on changing. And so it feels like everything we do is unprecedented. And the hard thing about living in this moment is, do we know, like we don't know in this moment whether this unprecedented is going to be unprecedented for some radically good changes or radically damaging changes, right? Like there's a lot of things that I think kind of scare us in some of the narratives, but then also we're going to be different in other ways. And so it's hard to be in this moment, right? Because we look back at history and we define these moments of massive transition. If not for this, then everything else wouldn't have come. But no one knows that you're in that moment until long after you've been in that moment, more often than not, right? It's very hard to say in this moment. There's been moments in our lives where we've said, this is that moment, and then not everything came of it. And so I think I was struck by the conversations we were having. I was struck by the people who wanted to talk about their great fears, and then finding people who weren't sharing those fears, people who felt like, what are the ways in which some of this rhetoric has been ratcheted up? What are the ways in which the rhetoric has been ratcheted down? So I don't know what any of this is going to mean. I do know that, to some of the points that have been made, I know that for many Israelis, what they voted for is not necessarily the same thing as, but let me be clear, the topics that they voted for, right? So many people are going to the polls and they're talking about exactly what we heard before, right? They're talking about security. They're talking about these massive issues that are impacting their day-to-day lives of how do we live in safety and security. And the coalitions that are getting built are then also talking about LGBTQ rights and Reform Judaism, which I'm not convinced that that's what most Israelis are thinking when they step into the polls. I don't know that most people are voting on Reform Judaism. And then Reform Judaism is suddenly on the political agenda. And what do we do with that? So that brings me to like the follow-up that I'm really thinking about, which is, I think at the core of a lot of this is, what's our role as Americans, right? Like if we're going to look at this and say, okay, you know, Israeli, like a democratic process means Israelis get to vote. I don't think any of us here are challenging the premise that this is a democratically elected government, right? None of us here are saying any, okay. Daniel's waving his head a little bit. Okay.
I don't know. I don't think you can call Israel a pure democracy when Jews in the West Bank get a vote and non-Jews don't. I mean, I think there always has to be that asterisk. And that to me is part of why this government isn't different, is that asterisk is there for liberal governments, not asterisk is there for right-wing governments.
Yeah, look, I also would say, though, I think every democratic election has an asterisk to it. I don't know that any democracy in the world is able to, you know, aspire to all. But I hear you, right? Like, so fine, like with your no, right? But I don't think any of us here, like, I'm trying to be very careful because I don't want to speak for any of you and you can all challenge it. But I don't think any of us are here are saying that that the election was stolen, that anybody did anything right? Like by the rules of Israeli democracy, the election took place. Israelis went to the polls. They voted. I knew a lot of people who didn't expect to actually get it done in one shot. Right? There is a government that's in place. It's a government that looks like it's going to last for some amount of time. I think probably longer than the last government lasted. Whether or not it goes the full term, I don't know that most Israeli governments don't. So for those of us that are here in America, right? I'm not trying to challenge then to put myself into the mouths of the people who are living on the ground in America, but knowing like where we started off by saying that to be an American Jew is to somehow be in relationship with Israel, and then bringing up all of these questions, concerns, hopes, fears, all of these things that I think many of us have named. Let's unpack that a little bit more to say, like, what does that relationship look like for each of you, right? And I want to be really clear that I think this is true for all the questions, but I really don't think there's a right or wrong answer. But I just want us to like really name for us, what does it mean as people who are currently sitting in St. Louis to be having a conversation about a country that's across the ocean that I can tell you from recent experience takes a very long time to get back from. Sorry, I landed the day that the FAA grounded all the flights. So the longest part of my travel was probably in Chicago. But what does it mean for us? So Jim, why don't I toss it to you first?
Well, I'll answer your question in just a moment, but I want to first say something that I think is important to say, which is, Rabbi Smason, I'm so glad you're here. And I really want to have a chance to hear your perspective on these issues. I think it's of tantamount importance, and maybe this is a way of beginning to answer your question, Rory. It's of tantamount importance that we in the United States, world Jewry, and Jews in Israel not allow political differences, even very disturbing, deeply convicted political differences, to come between us and to become a wedge in the Jewish community. And I fear, one of my answers to your question is, I fear that is happening now in a way that is more noticeable and more dramatic than at any time in my lifetime, at least. And I fear that. And so my gratitude to you for being with us today, Rabbi Smason, isn't just, general, it's specific, that we Jews and people who love Israel and care about Israel need to talk with each other now more than ever. And I don't see that happening very much. And we need to listen to each other and hear each other's perspectives. So I'm going to talk very quickly because I want to listen to Rabbi Smason, and because I think it's important for us to try and understand even when we disagree.
But only on the condition that you call me Zev.
Okay, thank you for that. And so a quick answer to my question is, and I just want to put this stake in the ground, and I feel odd even needing to say it, but I care deeply, as I believe most of the Jewish people I know care deeply about Israel. And the fact that I am disturbed by some of the specific realities of the current political situation today does not make me care any less about Israel. In fact, because I care so deeply, because I believe so much in a vision of what Israel can be as a homeland for Jewish people, as a state in the world of nations today, as a symbolic exemplar of Jewish values writ large, of what I think Judaism compels Jews to try and aspire to. Because of that, I am even more passionate when I don't like what I see or what I feel. And right now, I don't like a lot of what I see and what I feel and what I experience, both in Israel and when I learn about Israel. And I'm disturbed and I'm troubled and I'm motivated by my love for Israel to speak out and to act as I can and to try and influence. One of the questions in the chat that Joe Peerless asked about was how we feel about, for example, Senator Jackie Rosen trying to use her voice as a politician, an American politician visiting Israel, by refusing to meet with people whose viewpoints are so extreme and other than the values that we share as Americans or as American Jews. And I'm troubled by that, but I also understand it. I'm troubled whenever anybody boycotts anybody else. I think that's not an effective way to communicate, but sometimes it's a necessary way to communicate, to make a point. And so I respect her right to do that, to say, I'm not going to talk to people whose positions are so anathema to my values. But I wish we didn't have to do that. I wish we could talk to one another and build alliances of shared values rather than enemies from people that are our people. So I'll stop there because I can say a lot more, as you know, but I'm not going to.
Well, we got more time. Daniel.
Yeah, I was so into Jim. I'm like thinking back, what was our question here? It was
I was asking broadly about what does it mean to be an American in St. Louis having this conversation, and what is that relationship for you?
For me, it's connection and obligation. I feel incredibly connected to Israel, and part of that is the amount of time that I've spent there. Part of that is the number of friends that I have there and family members that I have there, right? That's always the difference when the rockets are falling is, do you know the people, right? Do you have people you love who are over there? Changes everything, I think it always does. But I also feel really deeply obligated by and to and for Israel. My Jewish identity very much understands Jews as a people much more than a faith. Certainly we have a faith, but that fundamentally we are a people. And 40% of the Jews in the world live in North America, and 40% of the Jews in the world live in Israel. And to me, it's not optional, right? You don't get to opt out of peoplehood, and you don't get to opt out of the ways in which all of Israel, of course, in the broadest of senses, but also in the geopolitical sense, is responsible to and for each other. And, I think the other piece for me is that my sense of morality is that it's always about the way that the power that we have, to use it, to not use it, how we utilize it. And the truth of it is, American Jews have power when it comes to Israel, when it comes to our relationship to and with Israel, and to our Israeli friends and family members, and to our own government, and the way that our own government talks about and deals with Israel. And I guess my strongest sense is that this isn't, and this goes back to what you said, Rory, this isn't something that we ever can opt out of. I don't mean that we shouldn't ever opt out of. I mean that literally, that it's not something we can opt out of. We are obligated to and for Israel, whether we like it or not. Yeah.
Zev, I'll toss it to you.
Okay. Thank you, Rory. Just to follow up, at least to begin with, on something that Jim said, referring to Jackie Rosen, who who opted out of a particular conversation. And I'm reminded of something that happened in the community not long ago before a recent congressional uh, 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 election, where Cory Bush was, if I may use the term, stonewalling, meeting with members of the Jewish community. And then again, some may look at it a little bit differently, but then opportunistically, just before the election, took the opportunity to be able to meet with a number of members of the Jewish community, including the JCRC. And I feel that it was the right thing to do, to meet with a person who was a representative of the House of Representatives, regardless of how anathema anyone's particular feelings towards her might have been. So I share that example in agreement with you, Jim, and I say that by way of pointing out that there are a number of individuals. I don't think anyone who's present here, but there are a number of individuals, a number of rabbis even, who signed on to a letter who pledged to boycott Israeli ministers of Knesset because they disagree with their particular perspective. So I think that we can agree to disagree, but we can agree in a disagreeable way while respecting the democratic process. So that's a comment that I just wanted to add to the important point that I think that you made. But to get to your question, Rory, about what it's like to be an American, I think as much as it is possible for us to be able to understand what it's like to be an American, to put ourselves in the mindset of what it's like to be an Israeli or what it's like to be in Israel is something that's challenging to do. But I think it's, with a little bit of imagination and a little bit of research, it's not so difficult. The new government was elected after how many tries was it? Was it after 4 tries, 5 tries, 15 tries? How many times did it take before they came up with a new election? It was multiple times. And I think that the consensus is that it was security, that it was the security situation that led to the new mandate. And the security mandate came about because of a different situation. There are near daily Palestinian attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers that are causing fear and anger in Israeli society. And I've read that, and I've heard that from my children and my family who live there. And what's interesting is that the attacks don't fit into the past patterns. Prime Minister Netanyahu has described the violence as a new kind of terrorism that's been carried out by individuals. And he's described it as appearing often to be spontaneous and opportunistic. And many are undertaken, as I'm sure you've heard of, by young, unmarried Palestinians. And the most common weapon that's being used now is not the suicide vest. That's not the most common weapon that's being used now, but it's the kitchen knife. That's the most common weapon that's being used right now, the kitchen knife. And the second most common weapon that's being used is the family car that's being used against Israeli citizens. So there's been car attacks, there's been shootings, and something that many of those of you who are listening might not be aware of is that in addition to Israelis' intelligence services now being supremely challenged by huge amounts of terrorist activity from Gaza, the West Bank, and in Israel itself, there's now an ISIS presence inside Israeli, Arab, and the Palestinian community. There's now an ISIS presence there that's really up the game. And I think that's also something that's really gotten the attention of the people who are there. And there's just one other thing that I might share, if I may, if to continue along on this point. I think it was someone who once said, in speaking about the way that the security system was set up at Oslo, with all of the dreams that we had and the hopes that we had, someone once said that there was a young banker who asked a retiring banker, what the secret of success was in banking. And he said, good judgment. So the rookie then said, well, how do you get good judgment? So the older banker said, experience. And to which the youngster said, and how do you get experience? And the retiring banker said, bad judgment. So anybody who's been in business understands that, and anybody who knows anything about politics, whether national or local, understands that you learn a lot from experience as well. And I'll just give you one example that I think that many of our listeners might not be familiar with. And I think, and it's really, I'm just going to put my camera back on because, as I said, I apologize to the viewers for the problems that I'm having with my camera. But it's really something, if you take a step back, it's a shocking necessity. There's an anti-tunnel barrier that exists along the Israeli-Gaza Strip border. They refer to it as a smart wall. It's an underground wall that was constructed by Israel, the entire 25-mile length of the Israel-Gaza border, to prevent anti-Israel militant groups operating on the Gaza Strip, especially Hamas. And they found last year that there was a tunnel that was being excavated by Hamas that was 270 feet underground, that they were using cement that they got from Qatar, of course, the recent sponsor of the World Cup, that they got from Qatar, that was supposed to be used to build the infrastructure, that they were using against its citizens. So when you roll in all of the old with the new, and to come full circle, Rory, if I can, to answer your question of how can I as an American understand why Israelis voted the way that they did? When you take the old and you take the new, and you see that the number one obligation that parents have towards their children, that an institution has towards as congregational leaders, that we have towards our congregants, that a government has towards its citizens, is to protect its safety and security. So that's how I understand, based upon what it is that I've read and what I've heard, that has led to the new government that we have.
Rory, can I just share a thought?
Sure.
I genuinely appreciate and thank you for sharing that perspective, Zev. I think there is both much truth, and I don't think anybody would contest the legitimate principle of self-defense and, the legitimate fear of terrorism from, for example, Hamas and lots of terrible things that have been done. But thought one I wanted to say is, I learned as a young child from my parents, who both were deeply convicted Jews, the non-Jewish principle. I mean, it's not exclusively Jewish principle, but it is a Jewish principle, I think, that they taught this way. They said, 2 wrongs don't make a right. And what worries me, first of all, about what you're saying is that we can legitimize lots of things that I believe are wrong because, they're doing wrong things to us too. So the second point I wanted to make in response to what you said, I think, is that I personally, from what I've learned and studied and understand, is that this election was not a mandate. This election actually would have been much, much closer had certain alliances, for example, the Arab parties, not made a choice to withdraw their support from the coalition on the other side for other reasons, for political reasons. And I'm not sure that, and I think this week, the evidence we've seen of hundreds of thousands of Israelis protesting this government, and for example, Daniel's point about judicial wrongs that are being foisted upon the Israeli public, as well as just moral wrongs that are becoming normalized by this government. Two wrongs don't make a right. We can't just say it is far too neat and tidy to tie this up and say, well, people have to protect themselves. So these terrible terrorists are the reason that all these wrong things can now be justified. And I think I'm going to kind of push back and say that doesn't work for me, even though I acknowledge that, of course, people have the right to protect themselves.
So I so appreciate this conversation, and I want to first of all, I do want to go back to what you shared about Congresswoman Cori Bush, because I just feel the need to also clarify, because I do want people to know that we had actually been talking to her team about doing a visit for quite a while, and it was actually my fault that it was scheduled when it was, which I've apologized for numerous times, although maybe interesting to people. The reason why was because I was in Israel. I was in Israel for the summer. And so we had wanted to do it earlier. I had scheduled it earlier, and then her staff said, no, we want you to be there also.
Rory, may I interject by sharing that I meant in no way whatsoever any criticism of you or the JCRC?
I do appreciate that, but I want to, because others.
I want to clarify that there was no criticism whatsoever intended in my remarks about that.
And I do appreciate that. But I just wanted others also to know that, I really sit with this tension, and I feel like I sit in many ways like Jim and Zev, like this conversation that you're having between you. I'm the like, you're right and you're right and you're right and you're right, like the kind of classic Jewish joke of that. Like I maybe have shared this story in this group before, that one of the most impactful experiences that I remember having early on, this is going back a number of years, but I was with a group of people, and we met with a Christian Arab. I can't even remember now what denomination, Protestant, but like a bishop in Jerusalem, who was born in Jerusalem. And he was telling the story that his parents had lived in, I believe it was Haifa. And again, I apologize because I might be not telling over his story properly. But they lived in Haifa, and in 1948, they ran away during the War of Independence. They left, they were forced out. He didn't really go into details, but they had left their home. And years later, he went back to this home that had been the home that his parents had had. And he was standing outside, kind of just like looking right at it. I don't know if he had been a baby at the time or if he had heard stories about it, but he went back to this house, and he was standing there. And this, as he told the story, an Israeli woman came outside and, said, "Can I help you?" And he said, "Well, I just wanted to see the house. This was the house that my parents had owned before 1948. And he said she got really indignant, and she said, "I bought this house fairly." And when he told her the story, he said, she did. She bought that house fairly. And I think it was like a young woman, like it wasn't the person who had moved in 1948. He said she bought that house fairly and legally. And that's a true story. And my parents owned that house before 1948. And that's also a true story. And it was just like so profound for me kind of hearing that, where I often feel like we get scared to acknowledge these different parts of our stories, because to acknowledge parts of our stories feels like it undermines other parts of our stories, right? Where like what I was taking from that was sort of, for this woman to acknowledge that this man's parents had that house would be to sort of be saying like, oh, the house belongs to you. And that house could have changed hands 20 or 30, I don't know who had lived in that house before, right? But I believe firmly that like she had went and gotten to the bank and got a mortgage, and she was paying it off, right? Like she owned that house. Nobody was challenging that. And yet like we have the totality of all these stories, right? And so I sit with that. I sit with that tension of it. I sit with, I know I've also shared here, like I've spent much time in Hebron with the Jewish community in Hebron. And I've spent many a Shabbat there with people who, are putting their lives on the line to preserve these holy spaces for the Jewish community. And I've also gone back to Hebron with groups of people wanting to hear a multitude of stories, and had those same individuals, not remembering that in previous years they'd hosted me for Shabbat, yell at me and throw things at me for being with another group of people. Like all of these are stories. And so I feel like, I don't know, when I was a kid, I really liked that movie Frequency. I don't know if this is like an odd reference, but the movie basically, somehow the character, his father died when he was a young child, and he finds his old transistor radio and somehow is like able to talk to his dad, years before, and like saves his dad's life. And in the movie, he like has both memories. Like he remembers what it is to have not grown up with a dad, and then has these new memories of growing up with a dad. And then sometimes I feel like that with Israel. Like I remember, I know these stories, and like I can see this narrative of like one thing, and then I also see this narrative of this other thing. And I find it hard. I know everything that all of you are saying is true. I know that there's these horrible terror attacks. And when I was just there, I went with a group. I've been teaching a class at Greenville University. There was a group of Greenville students, Christians, who also were on a trip, on a January intercession trip, staying in a Christian university near the Jaffa Gate. And I went to join them for a tour of the old city, and there were all these police around because this very old Christian cemetery had been desecrated by Jewish vandals who had decided to go in and do it. And so part of it for me is like I grapple with like it turns out that, yes, like Jews also don't always act the way that I want Jews to act, right? I know that in America, I know that in Israel. What does that mean for me to be in relationship with this Jewish state that I spend a lot of time with, that I have a deep love and deep history for, and also know that that doesn't mean that people there can't act in ways that I don't support or I find reprehensible. And all of those things are simultaneously true. And neither one negates the other. Like for me, it's like, how do I hold those, right? Like one of those facts doesn't cancel the other fact. Like all of those are just actually facts.
Through this whole conversation, I keep thinking of this essay by David Hartman, Auschwitz or Sinai, which was one of these essays, a short essay written in the early 80s in response to the Lebanon war that just has radically changed me. I think about this essay a lot. But David Hartman talks about Auschwitz and Sinai as being different moral realities, that Auschwitz for him in this essay stands for a place of existential threat where we have almost no power. And Sinai represents a moment when we have the power to create the sort of society that lives up to the best of our values. And what he talks about throughout this essay is the danger that happens when you bring an Auschwitz mindset, right? And in a place where you have no power and you are under existential threat constantly, the only ethical response is to do anything you can to survive. The danger is when you bring that Auschwitz mindset to a moment of power and of Sinai, when we could be creating the sort of world and the sort of nation that Jewish values aspires towards. And I guess, Zev, I was listening to what you said about the idea of this is the security reality. And I think you're right that like so many Israelis were voting on this as a security election. And yet I also think that right-wing movements throughout the world are incredibly successfully right now convincing people to be scared and to feel powerless when in fact we have incredible amounts of power and opportunity. I think it's in the way in the United States, there's been so much fear-mongering during these elections around, around security and around fears of crime, when actually crime is near historic lows. And in fact, fear-mongering of crime in cities when rural areas are often much more dangerous than cities. And yet, right, it's a racialized notion that happens, or a racist racialized notion. And I worry that that's also what we're seeing in Israel, where we're seeing, again, demographic and racialized fears of an oppressed minority turned into fear-mongering that leads to right-wing elections and demagogues coming to power. And I think it speaks to not taking moral responsibility for the power that we do have, for recognizing that we live in an incredible moment of Sinai, where we have so much power as a Jewish people We live in this sort of reality for all of its issues that I really believe our ancestors would have looked at and said, you must be living in the Messianic era, right? Where Jews are such an unrepresentative percentage of and I'm going to sound like an anti-Semite now, of the business leaders and of Hollywood and of the media and of the American government, and where we have a thriving, stable, nuclear-powered state for Jews to be at home. And yet our politics all too often, I think, pretend like we are living in a moment of Auschwitz, where the only ethical response is our own survival. And it creates a reality where we don't live up to who we could be, and we don't create the sorts of worlds that I think Torah calls us to be creating.
I appreciate you sharing that. I can keep going on with other questions, but I mean, I also, if anyone wants to respond to that, like, it just was, there was a lot in that. Yeah, Zev.
Okay, thanks. I think that at the risk of throwing, if not a Molotov cocktail, maybe a little bit of a stink bomb over here into the conversation. But after all, you invited me to come to share a different perspective. But there was a very interesting poll that came out recently that was shared by the Israeli the 2022 Israeli Democracy Index. And the point of my sharing a few of the findings from this study suggests that the way that we as Americans in general, and the way that progressives in particular look at Israel is very different than the way that Israelis themselves look at Israel. So we have our hopes as Americans, speaking now about us as Americans, we have our hopes and our aspirations and our desires for the way we would like Israel to look, but Israelis don't necessarily look at Israel the same way, those who live there. And let me, if I may, just share with you a few examples, that some of which surprised me, and so they may surprise you. A survey was taken that shows that over the last 20 years, a higher percentage of younger respondents than older respondents identify as politically right-wing. The poll noted that in all age groups, the percentage of respondents on the right had consistently risen over the years. The Arab riots of the spring of 2021, who can forget those? That pushed the numbers higher in both groups. And Daniel, I think that speaks to a point that you made. There was a reaction, but nonetheless, there was a reaction to push the numbers higher in that way. Public trust in state institutions declined across the board in 2022. But here's something that I found to be particularly interesting. When asked, Israel is defined as both a Jewish and democratic state. In your opinion, which component should predominate? I'm just going to pause for a moment and ask if each of us were to think about how we would respond, or how our friends or how our congregants would respond, there would be a certain answer. But here's the way that Israelis responded to this question. Israel is defined as both a Jewish and democratic state. If you had to choose, which component should predominate? So respondents who belong to religious groups chose, not surprisingly, the Jewish component. Haredim, meaning the ultra or the fervently observant, 85%, national religious, 77%, traditional religious, 58.5%. But here's what I found surprising. Among the secular, and we know that a secular Israeli is a little bit different than a secular American. Among the secular, 51% said the democratic component should predominate, but 15% chose the Jewish component, but 31% of the secular said both components should be given equal weight. And And I would venture to say that that same question asked in temples across the United States would elicit a very, very different response. So I think that through the glasses through which we look at Israel sitting here in America, we look at America as the way we would like America to be and the way that America should be and the view that we have of the recent election that's taken place. But I think, and I'm happy to share that link, actually, let me post that link for those of you who are interested in looking at that article. But I think that that's a view of the way that Israel looks today. And I think that that helps at least me understand why so many Israelis look at Israel the way that it did, and that helps to understand the reason why the elections turned out the way that it recently did.
Thank you. Thank you for all that. And part of what I'm hearing of the, I don't want to say tension because I'm not hearing a tension, but part of what I'm hearing as part of this discussion is I think like there's a question that's driving all of us of what is our role as American Jews in relationship to Israel? To what extent is our role to support the Israelis who are there? And when they tell us, whether it's through their elections or through dialogue that we have or the personal relationships we might have, when we hear from Israelis on the ground what they think is best, is it our job to support that? And I'm also hearing this question of to what extent do we as American Jews have a different path relationship, right? Like we have a pipeline to Israel that's different than that relationship to Israel. And do we feel like we as American Jews also get a vote? And I'm using the kind of rabbit ears on that sense of vote, because obviously I don't mean a vote in the Knesset, but you know, we all vote with our voices, with our feet, with our money, with our resources, whatever it is, right? Like the ways in which we also express our opinion on things. You know, I find it interesting. There's many differences between Israeli democracy and American democracy. One of the things I find fascinating is that in Israel, you cannot vote in an Israeli election unless you are physically present in the country, unless you're on like shlichut, like if you are a government official, if you've been sent by Israel to do service, then you're able to vote at one of the consulates. But otherwise, you cannot vote unless you're in the country. Whereas in America, you can be anywhere. It's not just if you're in the military, right? Like and you're stationed abroad, but you can be anywhere and vote, which means that you can have American citizens who have been living in foreign countries for years, who have no intention of moving back to America, but who America says you're allowed to vote in elections. And like personally, I've always found that a little bit funny, right? Like if you've decided that your life is in France, like what does it matter who you think the president should be or who you think my congressperson should be? Like maybe you shouldn't get a vote on that, right? But America has said you still get a vote, and Israel has kind of made that distinction. And so I'm using that just kind of as the example of like those of us. I mean, I'm not a citizen of Israel. I have my parents are, my brother and my sister-in-law, and I have 5 nieces and nephews who all are, but I am not, right? I don't. So even if I was in Israel during an election, I would not get a vote. And yet in America, like part of what I'm also hearing you talking about, Jim, is like we do kind of have votes, right? Like we choose where we bring people, we choose where we donate our money, we choose how we talk about all of these things. And so I'm hearing like in this discussion, this sense of which are the glasses, right? So we said like you kind of wear different glasses, but am I supposed to be saying, okay, what do Israelis want me to do? Or to the extent that Israel is the Jewish state, do I as a Jew in this world also have an opinion on what Israel should be? And I'm naming those, and I'll pass it back to you in a second, Jim, because I see that you want to jump in. Like I just want to say I'm naming those as 2 pathways. And I think that the Jewish community is largely split about the answers to that question. I think we can have extensive debate about what that is. And I think part of it is, in many ways, to me, a tension between the fact that Israel is a modern political government. It is right. So like all those other things, meaning that it has all the messy things of taxes and wars and crime and jails and all those things, but also is like this aspirational place that has our Jewish history and our Jewish hope and our Jewish lives, right, wrapped up into it. And suddenly, like, all those things get really mixed together into what ultimately becomes like a really messy place, because all those things exist in 2023 when the world's a messy place. Okay, Jim, I'll let you.
I just wanted to state the obvious. It's obvious to me, and if it's obvious to me, it must be obvious to everybody. But it's not. I'm sure all of you have, maybe Zev less so than the rest of us, have been experiencing people who are saying things such as, I don't know if I can support Israel anymore, or Israel has moved with this new government so far from my values that I reject Israel. And I want to say what is obvious to me, which is that is absolutely not an option. I mean, it is an option. We live in a world where people are free, but it should not be an option for anybody who cares about Israel and anybody who cares about Judaism to reject Israel right now. And in fact, regardless of whether we have a literal vote, which we don't, I don't, I'm not a citizen of the state of Israel. I cannot vote whether I'm there or not. Regardless of that, we have an obligation as Jews who care about Israel to engage and to speak and to use our money to influence culture and politics and decision making, and to advocate and to visit and to care. And I always reject when anybody says, well, you know, you don't live there, so you don't get a voice. No, I don't get a vote, but I get everything else. As somebody who cares as a Jew, who cares as a lover of Israel and the vision of what Israel has always been dreamed to be for our people. And I think we all do. And now more than ever, we all need to engage more in this conversation. Second thing I just wanted to say before I before I mute myself, voluntarily, by the way, Zev, I really appreciated the statistics that you shared and look forward to reading it. But I'm far less interested in the choice between democracy and Jewish state than I am in the obligation to figure out how Israel can be a democracy and also reflect Jewish values. And I reject all the definitions of a Jewish state that mean, well, we can't be a democracy then. I am messianic perhaps in believing this, but we can be a moral Jewish state that cares for the rights of every citizen, not just the so-called Arab citizens of Israel, who, by the way, are Palestinians by self-definition, Palestinians who live in Israel and Palestinians who don't live in Israel, and all the other groups whose rights as human beings are being endangered by this current government in Israel. So it's not an either-or choice. That survey notwithstanding, democracy and Judaism do not have to be a binary choice. And I really believe that deeply.
I don't know that you don't have a lot of Messianic Reform Jews, Jim. Okay, Zev, you obviously want to jump in, and then Daniel, I want to make sure that you also get a chance, so we'll pass it to you after that.
Can I, Marie,
Please. Yeah,
Jim, I think on the point that you just raised, I think that probably out of 100 issues, maybe on 90 out of 100 issues, we would agree. But probably on 10 or so, we might disagree. Let me just throw out maybe 10 of those issues, or at least a couple of those issues upon which we might disagree. Let's take one that's obvious and one that I think has been brought up, the law of return. The law of return. So can we really say that Israel is a democracy in the purest sense of a democracy, when it allows only individuals who are Jews to have citizenship? So on the one hand, it's a democracy, and we take great pride in Israel being a democracy. But if you're an Albanian, a Methodist, if you're a Methodist or Unitarian or Episcopalian and you show up, you don't get a citizenship. If you're a Jew, you get a citizenship. So I'm not going to say that I can think of anything more undemocratic than that, but that's not democratic. And I'll just give you a second example. Let's take the Jewish national anthem, Hatikva, Nefesh Yehudi Homia, the Jewish soul longs. So I'm not going to throw another stink bomb over here about whether we should change the Jewish national anthem, which I personally don't think that we should. But on the one hand, we have a very diverse group of individuals that live in Israel. Not only, of course, Palestinians and Arabs, but we have Druze as well. Yet Israel was founded as a Jewish country and with the aspirations of the Jewish people to live there. Yet the national anthem speaks of the Jewish homeland and the longing of the Jewish soul. So I do agree with you, Jim, that there are many common denominators that we can agree upon. Yet I think that push is going to come to shove on a number of different issues where we're going to have to say, well, how are we going to resolve Jewish versus democratic when it at least comes to these and a couple other issues?
I really appreciate what you just said, Zev, and very much resonate with that. There was a Peter Beinart article that I sent around, I know, to Jim and Rory maybe a month or two ago, that really honed in on this, that after the recent election, there were a number of folks saying, oh, look at this new awful ultra-right-wing party in Israel. They're like the Trumpers, the MAGA folk of Israel. And Peter Beinart responded by saying, that's a profound misunderstanding of Israeli democracy and of Israeli society. That in the United States, there is a deep philosophical debate that is happening as to whether or not we should be a country primarily by and for white Christians, right? White Christian nationalism as a strong and emerging political force in the United States, and those who instead see the United States as a nation for all of its citizens and all of its residents. And that's a profound philosophical difference about the direction of the country. In Israel, on the other hand, by and large, the center, even some of the center-left parties, and the right all agree on this idea that Israel should be a state for Jews and not a state for all of its residents or all of its citizens. And that's a profoundly different political dynamic than I think American Jews often share, right? I don't think that's often the American Jewish political perspective, where very much American Jews have over and over voted that we see this country as a place for all of its citizens, a multicultural, multi-plural democracy, and Israelis who across the spectrum, perhaps other than the few left-wing parties which don't really exist anymore, right? I mean, it's stunning that the Labor Party doesn't really exist anymore and that Meretz doesn't really exist anymore. That by and large, there is consensus amongst those residents of Israel who have been granted the right to vote because they are Jewish, that should continue to be the dynamic, that Jews are the privileged people of an ethno-nationalist state. This Peter Beinart article really just struck me and has stuck with me, because I think that's a dynamic that about Israeli politics that often American Jews not only don't share, but don't understand about the Israeli reality and the Israeli electorate. And so I really appreciate you bringing that out, Zev, and very much resonated with what you said. And we may end up having differences on how we prioritize those things, but right, the understanding that reality, I think, is so important. So thank you.
So I have the unfortunate role of starting to wind us down now, because for as much as I've been having a blast, we are coming to the end of our time. And so what I'm going to do is let us each kind of have like a concluding thought. And so I'm going to start us off and pass it around. And then Zev, as our guest, I'll let you get the final word before I say goodbye to everyone. So I haven't decided yet, Jim and Daniel, what order you're going in. I'll decide when but I'll just take the liberty of starting us off. And I'm just, first of all, I want to go back to something that Jim said, I think early on, of like the importance of just having this conversation. And I think that's been a big reason why we wanted to create this space. I mean, certainly, if anyone wants to hire us to actually resolve these issues, we'll talk about it. But, I think like this has been a great opportunity. And also, I don't think anyone from the Israeli government is currently watching, taking notes, although they're welcome to. It's open to anyone. I feel like concluding remarks are not the place to add another piece to it, but I would feel remiss if I didn't also say that I think part of my own struggle with like where to sit within all of this is also the ways in which I feel really pushed as an American Jew by American institutions because I work in American Jewish community, and also just like my whole life of growing up in the Jewish community, where I feel like the American Jewish community really pushes people to take a stance on Israel, and ways in which I have felt not just criticized, because I'm really, I think we can have a really productive conversation, but ways in which I have my family has come under attack. I've come under attack, for what sometimes has been from some people just a perception of not being strong enough in the ways that they want to be, right? I mean, I just want to say, like, our American Jewish community has really built this structure around Israel in ways that, when I say, like, you can't be a Jew in America and not have a relationship with Israel, that's on part a theological statement for me, but it also is actually just a reality statement that it is very hard to belong to an institution in America and somebody not force you to take a stance. And that, I think, comes with a lot of challenges as well. And so I don't leave here necessarily having any more clarity about what all of that looks like. But I think with just really understanding that all of us are holding, for me, I keep coming back to this idea of multiple truths, right? That like all of these things can be held in tension. I think that's part of the beauty of Judaism, is that we're able to recognize the multitude of realities all simultaneously, and that also and also the idea of wrestling, right? That also seems to me like a core Jewish value. And so I think it's really easy to be complacent in any direction on this, and so I'm not compelled by any argument that makes it overly simple. I find already specious, and I'm just really grateful to be with all of you and really like stepping into the complexity of this. So thank you. Jim?
Thank you for what you just said, Rory. I think it was really powerful. And I want to echo your gratitude to Ze'ev for joining us and sharing with us in this dialogue. It's so important. And I want to say again, for fear of repeating the obvious, we don't do this enough. In the St. Louis Jewish community, which, we're not that, we're big, but we're not that big, that we, members of the Jewish community who disagree with one another on some things and agree on others, don't even know each other that well. And we certainly don't engage in learning together or talking honestly and openly. I think we insulate ourselves all too often in our own echo chambers, against those who might make us feel uncomfortable with their beliefs or with whom we disagree, or whatever causes us. And I'm so grateful for you sharing your point of view. And I do disagree with you on a number of things, but I agree that we share a shared vision of, peace and justice and a Jewish state that will be secure. We do. We just have very different ideas about how to get there and what compromises we may need to make along the way. And I'm always reminded of, the teaching of our tradition that says, Lo alachem l'chalik more, it's not our responsibility, Rory. We didn't get hired to solve this problem. But we're also not free to walk away from it. And I think far too often members of the Jewish community do walk away. We walk away from trying to figure out a way to coexist with people with whom we disagree. And we often walk away from the really hard challenges that I at least perceive in Israel. And I just want to restate once again, I do believe it is possible for Israel to be both a democratic Jewish state and moral and ethical and consistent with all the highest values of Judaism. And that doesn't mean excluding or compartmentalizing people, human beings, or principles. I do. It's hard work. I have no idea how to do it, but I refuse to walk away from that challenge and look forward to maybe more opportunities to learn together with you, Ze'ev, and with others, because we're more likely to come to a solution working together than we are fighting with each other.
Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, I just want to join Rory and Jim in thanking you, Zev. It was a real treat to speak with you and hear your Torah and to learn together. And yeah, a real treat. Thank you. I guess I have two closing thoughts, short ones. The first is, I think in the American Jewish context, we often get caught into this divide of, AIPAC versus J Street, or both of them versus JVP, or whatever it is, the ways that we draw the lines here. And I think one of the profound things we miss is the J Street folks and AIPAC folks, and even I think JVP folks have a lot more in common and are closer to each other than any of us are to those who have chosen to opt out of the conversation altogether. And I think when we reframe it that way, hopefully it can help us have these conversations and build these bridges. The second piece is just returning to our Rebbe, David Hartman, of a blessed memory, that I believe with every ounce of me that we are standing at a Sinai moment and not at an Auschwitz moment. I think we have incredible power, and that power requires a moral response and an ethical reckoning with that power. And that I think that's where we each have to start as individuals, as institutions, as an American Jewish community, with recognizing that we really do have profound power and that we have to use it morally. And choosing to always support the status quo is not apolitical, it's a deeply political decision, right? Choosing to say that we're not being political always just upholds the way that it is. And that's about as political of a decision as you can make. So I will end with that and turn it over to you, Zev.
It's not often, especially in my own home, that I get the last word. So I want to thank you very much for this rare opportunity. I'd like to begin by reiterating special thanks to Jim and Dan and especially to you, Rory, as well, for facilitating this opportunity to speak with you. And I think that the hour or so that we've shared gives testimony to the fact that that it is indeed impossible to disagree, but to disagree in an agreeable way. And just because we have differences of opinion doesn't mean that we can't disagree agreeably and have a discussion. And I think that if anything, I think that our discussion this afternoon has shown that in expressing and learning from each other our various opinions and sharing that with the community at large that's viewed what it is that we've seen. A couple points that I'll share about a number of politicians who've come under vigorous protest. There have been a number of American politicians who in their early days have offered various opinions about certain things, but were given the benefit of the doubt by saying that their opinions evolved over a period of time. And both contemporary and ancient politicians, and I'm not going to make mention of any of their names, but I think that you could all probably have in your own mind images of individuals who later came to cast key votes that changed the social fabric of our country when, as senators and then later as higher ranked politicians, they changed their minds. Well, they changed their minds, but they framed it as having evolved. So those politicians in the government now, in Netanyahu's government now, who are being castigated for certain opinions that they had when they were there, maybe they won't change their minds, and maybe they won't evolve, but the possibility does exist that they will evolve, because people do evolve. At least I'd like to think that some people do evolve and mature in their opinions. And ultimately, as someone pointed out, I think an astute political pundit pointed out, ultimately the policies of the government is going to be determined by the prime minister. So there's going to be a whole slew of voices that are going to be heard, much like in the same way, like in previous administrations, such as in the current one, both on the Democratic and the Republican aisle. There are a lot of different voices, but that doesn't mean that because politician A or politician B says something, that that's policy. In the end of the day, in Israel, we've got a prime minister, and that's going to drive the policy. So and just one final point that I'll make, in the previous government, although there were individuals that I consider to have been anathema to a coalition, yet I didn't hear any calls for those individuals to be ostracized. I'm very pleased to hear that there are no such calls from our esteemed panel today. We're calling from those individuals to be ostracized as well. And although you may have profound disagreements with those individuals, you respect the fact that a democracy is a democracy, and we'll work with the democracy that we have, and we'll pray for and we'll hope for the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you for those of you who are joining at home. We're always so grateful for all of the opportunities that we have to be together, and we look forward to joining you again next month with our next special guest. I don't have it pulled up right now, but all of you should have received more information, and this is the new link. So thank you all for being with us. Have a wonderful rest of